The retirement ceremony was winding down when Admiral Richardson spotted him. An old veteran sitting alone in the corner, his weathered hands folded over a cane, medals gleaming on his chest like distant stars. Something about the man's quiet presence drew the Admiral across the room, past clusters of younger officers sharing war stories and laughter. "Mind if I join you?" Richardson asked. The veteran looked up, his pale blue eyes carrying the weight of decades. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. As they sat in comfortable silence, the Admiral noticed the faded insignia on the man's jacket, the kind worn by fighter pilots from an era when men flew into the sky with nothing but instinct and courage. "You flew in the Gulf War?" Richardson asked. The old man nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. A lifetime ago." The Admiral smiled. "Every pilot has a story. What was your call sign?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The veteran's fingers tightened around his cane, and for a moment, Richardson wondered if he'd overstepped. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the old man said, "Ghost 5." The color drained from Admiral Richardson's face. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" The veteran met his gaze steadily. "Ghost 5. That was my call sign." Have you ever heard a name that changed everything you thought you knew? A single word that unlocked a mystery you'd carried for years? Because what happened next would reveal a truth that had been buried for 3 decades, a story of sacrifice so profound that grown men would weep when they finally understood. The Admiral set down his cup with trembling hands. "That's impossible," he breathed. "Ghost 5 went down over the desert in '91. We searched for 3 days. There were no survivors." The old veteran's face remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of pain that time had never quite erased. "There was one survivor, Admiral. Me. But I wasn't supposed to make it back." The room around them seemed to fade as the old man began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of a secret he'd held close to his chest for too long. He told of that January night when his F-16 had been hit by enemy fire, how he'd managed to eject but landed deep in hostile territory. He'd been injured, alone, with a broken radio and enemy patrols closing in. For 3 days, he'd crawled through the desert, surviving on rainwater collected in his helmet and the raw will to see his newborn daughter one more time. But on the 4th day, he'd heard it, the rhythmic thunder of a rescue helicopter. Hope had surged through his broken body. He'd fired his last flare into the dawn sky, a brilliant red streak against the pale morning light. The helicopter had turned toward him. He'd wept with relief. Then he'd seen them, a convoy of enemy trucks racing across the sand, heading straight for a position where he knew his squadron was planning a strike. If those trucks reached the ridge, they'd ambush his brothers. 12 American pilots would die. The old man's voice cracked as he continued. The helicopter was 2 minutes away. Safety was 2 minutes away. His daughter, his wife, his life, all just 2 minutes away. But those trucks would reach the ridge in 4 minutes. He looked at the radio transmitter in his hand, damaged but possibly still able to send one final burst transmission. He'd looked at the approaching helicopter, and he'd made a choice that would haunt him forever. He'd radioed the enemy position, breaking radio silence, knowing it would give away his location, knowing the enemy would converge on him instead of continuing to the ridge, knowing the helicopter would have to abort. As enemy vehicles surrounded his position, he'd watched the helicopter veer away, the pilot following protocol, unable to risk the bird for a downed pilot in a hot zone. He'd been captured within minutes. "I spent 6 months as a prisoner," the veteran said quietly. "When I finally made it home, the war was over. My squadron had completed their mission. All 12 pilots survived that day. But Ghost 5 was listed as killed in action. They'd held a memorial. My wife had remarried, believing I was dead, trying to give our daughter a father. I was offered a choice: come back from the dead and destroy the new life my family had built, or let Ghost 5 stay dead. Let them have peace." The Admiral's eyes were wet. "So you just disappeared?" The old man nodded. "I took a medical discharge under a different name, moved to a small town, worked as a mechanic. I watched my daughter grow up from a distance, saw her graduate, get married, have children of her own. She never knew her real father died so that 12 other fathers could come home. The silence between them was sacred. Finally, the Admiral spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I was one of those 12 pilots, son. I flew that mission. We hit that convoy position and never knew why they weren't there waiting for us. We thought it was luck, but it was you. It was always you. The old veteran's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered face as the Admiral stood and wrapped him in an embrace, two warriors connected by a sacrifice that transcended time and duty. Your daughter deserves to know, Richardson said firmly. She deserves to know what her father did, what he gave up. The old man looked up, hope and fear warring in his ancient eyes. Do you really think so? The Admiral smiled through his own tears. I know so. Because heroes don't just win battles. Sometimes they win them by giving up everything they love. And that story needs to be told. As the sun set outside the window, Admiral Richardson made a phone call that would finally bring Ghost 5 home, not from the desert, but from the shadows where he'd hidden his heroism for 30 years. Because some sacrifices are too great to remain buried, and some love runs too deep to stay silent. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that real heroes walk among us in silence, carrying burdens we'll never see, then share it. Honor those who gave everything, not for glory, but for love. Because somewhere, someone you know is carrying their own silent sacrifice, and they deserve to know they're not forgotten. They deserve to know they matter. Just like Ghost 5 finally learned, it's never too late for the truth to come home.